And now our series 2011 Reveal continues with one of the central figures in the Gulf spill saga. We're talking about Ken Feinberg, in charge of the $20 billion Victims Fund, and he joins us now here in studio. Great to have you back with us.
Glad to be here.
So how's it going in terms of paying out these claims?
Oh, it's going pretty well. In 4 months, we've already paid out about $2.7 billion to 170,000 people.
Okay.
The program stays in place until August of 2013.
Right.
And right now, every claimant, whether they've filed yet or not, has three different choices about a final payment.
You've come under some criticism about saying that if they accept a claim here, they accept a payment, that they can't go and then file some lawsuits. Do you agree with the criticism that's come across with that?
Well, the reason that criticism is justified, if that was the only option, it would be justified. But don't forget, if you don't want to give up your right to sue,
right,
you don't have to.
Right.
You can come into the fund and take quarterly interim payments, prove your damage, and continue to have the right to sue if you so desire.
But you know the criticism, and forgive me, I'm going to go after, because there's been a lot said, and they say that people aren't understanding fully that they really have the right to go out and sue, that they're being pressured to take a payout from the fund. Is that true?
That is not true, and I find that rather interesting. I've received 450,000 claims.
Right.
I've paid out 170,000 people $2.7 billion. It's hard for me to believe that people don't carefully weigh their options and decide what's best for them in their individual case.
$2.7 billion, but
so far.
It's a $20 billion fund.
Right.
Ken, do you anticipate you're going to use all that $20 billion?
Well, don't forget, that $20 billion is not just for the Gulf Coast claims process. It's also being used for cleanup costs, remediation in the Gulf. I think, based on the statistics that I'm looking at, that $20 billion hopefully will be ample.
Let me ask you about something. Let me go back for a second. How much then, as you said, a bunch of it's being used for cleanup, how much do you think will ultimately be paid out?
Remains to be seen, but I would hope that half that money would be more than enough to pay all the claims.
One thing that we found interesting, and that you've gotten more than 460,000 requests for money, that sounds about right. Of those, slightly more than half have been denied. Is it that a full 50% of the claimants are dishonest?
Not dishonest, but
misguided? How would you describe it?
No, they don't have documentation. Now, I'll pay claims, and I will bend over backwards to pay claims.
Right.
But when somebody comes to me and says, I'm a fisherman, I lost 3 months of wages, $30,000, and all they attach is a fishing license.
Hard to buy it?
It's hard to buy it. And I can't just pay claims with not insufficient, no documentation. And that's the reason for many, many of the denials.
All right, I don't want to stir the pot, but you know I'm going to do it, because I'm going to go back to some of the critics who say you are, and I've talked to you a lot of times, and I find this hard to believe, but that you're a pawn of BP because you're being paid by BP. What do you say to them?
Who else is going to pay the freight for this entire program? You can't ask the claimants, the victims in the Gulf, to pay. You can't ask local or state or federal government to pay the cost of this program. BP has willingly stepped up and said it will pay the cost of administering this entire program. If somebody has a better idea, I'd like to hear what it is.
I mean, is there a better idea out there?
No, there isn't. BP, in these large facilities, you'll remember the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund. There, the taxpayer paid. The federal government paid the freight.
But Ken, do you kind of understand why people might say there's a conflict of interest because you are being paid by BP? I know you guys recently, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think a professor from, was it NYU?
That's right.
Was hired, also being paid by BP, to basically say you're not in conflict of interest.
That's right.
Why did you do that?
He's the most nationally respected legal ethicist in the country, Professor Gillers, Stephen Gillers. He issued a report. He looked at this whole thing. He said Mr. Feinberg and the Gulf Coast Claims Facility are absolutely independent of BP. He flat out said it. Who other than BP is going to pay the cost of administering a massive, unprecedented program like this?
But why do you need to have a professor come in and say that?
Because the Attorney General of Louisiana wrote me a letter and said, Ken, constructive criticism, we're working together on this, but I sure would like to warn you that there might be a perception that you're not independent. Well, the minute I get a letter like that from the Attorney General of Louisiana, highly respected, A.G. Caldwell, nice guy, I went out and hired somebody to independently confirm my independence.
What do you think is going to happen to all those class action suits that are out there?
Oh, that's the courts.
That's the courts.
I'm distancing myself. That's Judge Barbier and the multi-district panel in New Orleans. Very, very able judge. He's in charge of the litigation. Right. I'm not part of that. I'm administering this separate alternative program.
One last question on the BP front. When do you think this will be all said and done? All the claims done with and dealt with?
August 2013 is the deadline for people to file with the Gulf Coast Claims Facility. They have plenty of time. Somebody who says I'm rushing things, or if I'm rushing, it's to get money out to the victims of this spill.
Okay.
But people have plenty of time to weigh their options.
But you think it'll take till 2013 to get this done?
I hope not.
Okay.
I hope not. One of the great advantages of this program, if for example, if you submit a claim now seeking just $5,000 of an individual, $25,000 if you're a business, we'll pay that claim within 2 weeks.
So pretty quickly.
You've got to give up your right to sue, but you'll get paid within 2 weeks. 30,000 people have already taken that option.
A lot of people. All right. Now, before taking on his role of the Gulf Victims Fund, he took on another tough role, very tough role, in fact, as Wall Street's paymaster, and we're going to talk about that right now. You and I talked about this a little bit of break. You don't like being called the pay czar, and everybody called that. Why didn't you like it?
It makes it sound like in that job that I took on at the request of Secretary Geithner in the administration, it makes it sound as if I was issuing some sort of arbitrary imperial edicts from on high. Those executive pay decisions, most of them, we sat down with each of the 7 companies and we worked out a fair, workable compensation system.
They were pretty open at that point because of everything that was going on in terms of the crisis, correct?
I think that's right. They realized there was great populist revulsion at some of this pay, and we took that on.
But as that goes away, do you think we're going to get back to our old bad ways in terms of Wall Street compensation?
Well, it remains to be seen. One thing I've learned about working at Treasury, you can't paint with too broad a brush. Look at each company, its culture, how it operates, what the pay looks like, it's the prescriptions on pay. You can't reach too many general conclusions.
All right, but I'm going to make one broad brushstroke right here, Ken, because this year could rank as Wall Street's second best. So they're making big money again. Does that, to you, suggest maybe something's gone awry?
Yes, it does. But again, I had jurisdiction over just 7 companies. And as to those 7 companies, I can't speak today on with you, but I'd like to go back and look and see whether those companies have gone back to the old way of doing things, or whether they're maintaining some of the prescriptions that I recommended at the time.
But let me ask you, when you look at Wall Street, we've all said, okay, or folks that say, you know, we're no longer too big to fail. But do you feel like what you're hearing about what's going on Wall Street, that they are taking steps to avoid risk and being smart with compensation packages overall, to avoid that excessive risk-taking and to avoid being too big to fail again?
Again, looking at different companies in different circumstances, but I would have my fingers crossed and say yes. I think there is an effort to avoid that type of risk-taking by, for example, tying compensation to long-term stock in the company, for example, so that everybody has a vested interest in protecting their own compensation.
So when you hear Goldman, they're supposed to be possibly weighing 2000 packages for a year, granting bonuses that depend on future earnings in addition to stock performance. That's what you want to see.
That's right. The problem with some of these companies, that's what I want to see. The problem is sometimes the magnitude of the compensation is just so great that at a time when you have unemployment problems, as we do in this country, there is a real gap between Main Street thinking and Wall Street.
But is it just a gap, or is it again maybe the potential that they're taking on too much risk, and that's why they're being paid so much, because they're generating a lot of money for the firms and then they're being compensated for it?
It may be that. It may be that they're having a good year and they're just lavishing this compensation on high-end officials. You have to look at each company.
Do you feel, though, we're in a better place with Wall Street compensation?
Oh, I think that what I did, and more than what I did, what Congressman Frank and Senator Dodd did, what the SEC is doing, the Federal Reserve, Sheila Bair at the FDIC, Secretary Geithner with the G20 on compensation, that's where you're getting, I think, the biggest bang in trying to limit runaway executive comp.
So no worry that in 5 years something happens again, a crisis, and the administration's going to be calling you up and saying, Ken, we need some help?
I worry about that every day.
You do?
Every day.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Ken, thank you so much. Have a great New Year.
You too.
Pleasure,
Thanks
as
so
always.
much.
Ken Feinberg, everybody.